You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show a very special guest, a woman who runs a very popular website called HebrewHelper.com, which is designed to help new olim, new immigrants to Israel, when they're having a little trouble with Hebrew. And she also teaches Hebrew one-on-one at YouCanLearnHebrew.com. But that's not the reason why I brought her onto the show today. This very exceptional young woman is also a teacher of personal finance, and in fact, she is my daughter, Chana Goldstein. Chana, a real pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Abba.
You recently gave a class to young women about personal finance. I'd like to understand what you taught, but tell us, who were you actually teaching?
I was teaching a group of Benot Shirut, a group of girls in national service.
And what did you teach them?
I taught them 3 basic skills of personal finance.
Okay, let's go through one at a time.
The first skill I taught them is the importance of keeping track of your money.
What do you mean by that?
Before you can do anything, you really have to know where you stand and know how much you spend, where you spend. So keeping track of your receipts and entering that information into an app or into a computer program, which will categorize it into the categories of clothing, food, groceries, dining, all of those, just being able to see where your money is and keeping track of how you're spending will turn you into a wiser spender.
Okay, so before we move on to points number 2 and 3, explain to the listeners how you actually keep track of your spending.
The way I actually keep track of my spending is every time I buy something, I take the receipt and I stuff it into my wallet, and at the end of the month I pull out all my crumpled receipts and I take a look at them and I enter the information from the receipts into a computer program called Quicken. For some expenses that I don't have receipts, for example, if girls are getting together to buy a gift for somebody and I only give a couple of shekels, I take a little scrap of paper and I myself write down the date, the amount, and what category it should be put under.
Right, this is not bookkeeping because you're a business, it's bookkeeping to keep track of where you are spending money.
Exactly.
So you said you taught 3 things. The first one was to keep track of where you spend your money. What was number 2?
Number 2 was being able to differentiate between what you need and what you want.
That must have gone over very well with young people.
Yes. And by that I mean no.
What happened?
They didn't quite get the reason or the importance of defining between what they need and what they want. They were able to say bigger pictures of what you need, but breaking things down into smaller categories, they had a hard time distinguishing between the two.
Can you give an example?
Sure. An example that I gave was going to the gym. We all know that exercise is very important. So what about getting a membership to a gym? Going out and working out in a nice air-conditioned environment. Is that a need or a want?
Well, it sounds like people should be exercising. We do encourage people to exercise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's true. But there are other ways to exercise too. You could go running on the road. You could do sit-ups in your house. This is the nuances of defining between a need and a want. It's a need for everyone to do exercise. But is going to the gym a need, or is that a want? So of course, if you have the money and you're capable of it, going to the gym is an awesome idea. But if you're not able to have the luxury of being able to pay for the gym, then you have to realize that it's only a want and not a need.
All right, so we've gone through the first 2 things you taught. The first thing you said is that people should simply keep track of their spending, and you told that to a group of young women. The second thing you said was that they have to distinguish between wants and needs. And what was the third thing that you told them?
The third thing I spoke about was the importance of not using credit cards.
I think I've spoken about that on the Goldstein on Gelt show before. What did you tell them about why not to use credit cards?
I said that people who use credit cards simply spend a lot more. It's just a fact. You could find reasons for it, such as psychologically, people using plastic feel like they're not spending money, so it's easier to buy larger purchases. But regardless of what the reason is behind it, the simple fact is that people spend more when using a credit card. And therefore, a way to not spend more is just using cash.
That's a good idea. There was actually a great study that I wrote about in my book, Rich as a King, where we spoke about how these strategies of chess can be applied to investing. But one of the interesting tidbits of research we found was that people that went to McDonald's, when they bought lunch with a credit card, they spent over $7. And when they bought lunch with cash, they spent about $4. So they were spending almost double the amount of money when they used a credit card versus cash. So, Chana, I think that's actually a very important point. We're talking with Chana Goldstein, who is the owner of a very popular website called HebrewHelper.com, which is designed for people who live in Israel, but whose Hebrew may not be so strong. And she also teaches people Hebrew one-on-one at youcanlearnhebrew.com. And she has been speaking recently with young adults about how to properly manage their money. And she recently was invited to speak to a group of Benot Shirut, women who are serving in national service, serving their country, who don't really earn a lot of money, but they need to hopefully learn some of the basics about how to handle their portfolio. Chana was explaining to us in the first half of the interview that she taught them the importance of keeping track of their money. She taught them the importance of differentiating between wants and needs. And she said, you got to be careful about using a credit card because, as she very correctly pointed out, people who use plastic tend to way overspend. So, Chana, tell me, what did the group think of your ideas?
They were very skeptical.
Oh, no.
Very skeptical.
Why do you suppose that is?
People don't like to change. People want to feel like what they are doing is correct. And want to keep doing what they're doing because it's easier. One of the young adults said, she said, well, I actually think using a credit card is better because when I use a credit card, I spend less money. She continued on and said, and Chana, you even are contradicting yourself. Because in your first point you said, keep track of your money. And in your third point you said, don't use a credit card. But if you use a credit card, you could keep track of all your spendings online.
So were you contradicting yourself?
I was not.
All right, so explain that.
If theoretically all of your purchases were in a credit card, then you would have then there would be some logic to this saying. But because for most people it's not like that, so keeping track of your money would just still be complicated because you would have to keep track of your cash and your credit card. And the other point I mentioned was that even if that is so, we could be responsible enough to keep track of our money and to not use a credit card in order to help us save the money. These are two different habits that you should get into, and even though you might seem to think that you could avoid both of them, so to speak, by doing something different, that different thing is just going to harm you.
So, do you ever use a credit card? You can be honest.
I do.
Okay, how come?
If I haven't withdrawn enough cash, then I use a credit card.
All right, but you're pretty good, actually, I happen to know, at pacing the way that you spend your cash because you keep track of it. So one of the issues that I think a lot of Israelis have, or Americans who've moved to Israel, or Americans as well, is that they themselves are not very good at handling their own money, which puts them in kind of an awkward situation to teach the next generation. Do you have a theory for how we can tell people? I think most of the listeners to Goldstein on Gelt are very likely parents, and they want to get their kids into good financial habits like you have. What would you tell them to say or do or threaten their kids so that they become as financially responsible as you are?
I don't think threatening is the way, first
All
of all. I think being a personal example. I think that's really the way. If they see their parents keeping track of their receipts and entering that information into the computer and sitting down together and talking about the budget, I think that in and of itself is a great example for the kids. Tips about teaching your kids, there are millions of them out there. But in order for you to teach them, you first have to do it yourself.
I think that's very true. I think it's hard to, you're a hypocrite if you tell your kids not to spend and then they find that you're way in debt or buying things you probably can't afford. Chana, we are just about out of time, but in the last minute or so, tell people, what is Hebrew Helper all about? What does it look like, and how can people benefit from it?
Hebrew Helper is a company that I started in order to help olim, people who came to Israel, deal with the Israeli bureaucratic system. We all know how terrible bureaucracy is, and Hebrew Helper is a solution to these people who have trouble speaking Hebrew. What we do is, when you receive different documents and forms and emails and all of the, being bombarded by Hebrew text around you, what you do is you snap a shot of the picture, you email it to us, and we respond to you about what the document is all about. We give you the practical advice of what you need to know.
So what would be an example of that?
An example could be something like you got a note from your kid's school, and it's very long and complicated, and you don't know what it is, so you'll send it to us, and we'll tell you very simply, your kid has a school trip next week, he has to bring a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a tent, and you have to return the permission slip by Tuesday.
Yeah, I think that's actually very useful, because one of the areas that I always joke about is that in Hebrew, I'm very good in Hebrew in talking about stocks and bonds and mutual funds in my own field, but I never quite did very well in the Old Pond about parent-teacher conferences. So I, of course, relied on my own children, but when they were little, it was kind of difficult to have them translate. So I definitely see the need for this. So, Chana, in the last few seconds, just tell me, how can people find you and follow the work you're doing?
Well, people could find a Hebrew Helper by just going to www.hebrewhelper.com.
And if they want to get private Hebrew lessons?
Then they could go to www.youcanlearnhebrew.com.
All right, and we will put links to both of those at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Chana, a real pleasure to have you. I hope we'll have you back on the show to talk to us about how to teach kids about money.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.